Mwade, be thankful unto the Most High, Mother, Father, Creator of the universe. Kwazai Muzima Mukulu, give praises unto our great ancestors, African power for all African people. This is Shakara, live and in session. Just wanting to deliver this presentation that I have entitled Towards African Liberation, Revolutionary Culture and Economics in Practice. Yeah. It was a presentation that I put together to be delivered at the Re-Engaging Pan-Africanism Conference in Birmingham City University in December 2018. I presented and put together the presentation with the assumption that I'd have about 15 minutes to an hour to deliver it. In the end, I had 15 minutes. So obviously I had to condense what it is I was, going to say, but decided based upon the response to the thing to really, do a video, that allows me to, present the fuller presentation in that same space of time between 50 minutes to an hour. And see how it goes. So basically, that's how long the presentation will be. Maybe a bit more because obviously I don't have any time constraints right now. So I'll probably go a bit more fuller into explaining certain things. But I was actually able to choose my own topic for the conference. And so I chose this, and the reasons why will become evident as I go through the presentation, okay? All right, so I do hope ones get something from it. And please, I am encouraging and welcoming feedback in terms of what is being presented here, and hope that you feel moved to do so. Good, bad, or indifferent. All right. Okay, let's go. So we're going to first begin by defining some terms. And the first term that we are going to define is liberation. Liberation. And the reason why I'm going to define liberation is because liberation is the intended goal of Pan-Africanism. Liberation is the intended goal of Pan-Africanism. I was listening to Mama Marimba Annie recently. When she was speaking at one of the Harlem debates on the question of is the election of Barack Obama good for Black people? And one of the things that she emphasized, based upon some of the splits that were taking place among the Pan-African or Black nationalist movement, was that we assumed that we have the same goals, but we never defined what they were. And so it's important for us to define what the goal of Pan-Africanism is and get some clarity on what that looks like. So this definition is presented by brother leader Mbandaka, the spiritual leader of the Archimel Revivalist movement, and my father. And this is how we were taught, as children in the Archimel Revivalist movement, that liberation means the acquisition of the power to be the masters of our own destiny. This means to have control over every aspect of our lives with the capacity to define, defend, and develop ourselves, thus determining our own destiny. So you see the underlines there. Acquisition of power. Liberation is about power acquisition. And we were taught that power is the capacity to effect your own will. So it's based upon a knowledge of yourself, what the self needs, and being able to affect, that will in terms of developing, creating what the self needs and what reinforces the self, with the capacity to define, defend, and develop ourselves, understanding that the process of invasion, colonization, enslavement, and neocolonialism, as we call it today, was a process by which Africans were denied the capacity to define ourselves, denied the capacity to defend, what it is that we produce, what it is that we create, and denied the capacity to develop ourselves in ways that reinforced who we were. So liberation, therefore, is the acquisition of the power to be able to affect all of these things, once again, in today's world. And I hope that makes sense so far. All right. So moving on now, we want to sort of define what liberation is not. And the reason why this is important is because we are currently caught up on a number of, ideas, and distractions from a liberation agenda. And I'm going to give greater expression to this in a second. But by liberation, we do not simply mean independence, democracy, equality, integration, assimilation, reform, anti-apartheid, anti-colonialism, anti-slavery. We don't simply mean abolition, civil rights, human rights, equal opportunities, justice, positive discrimination, humanism, humanitarianism. We don't simply mean universalism, racial harmony, multiracialism, multiculturalism. cultural diversity, progress, socialism, liberalism. Yeah, we don't simply mean these things. And I'm going to draw out three of these concepts here and just emphasize them a little piece. We don't simply mean democracy, development, and globalization. The reason why these are emphasized is because these are three buzz terms in today's geopolitical environment that are used, to refer to the Africa at the moment. If we look at the framework of Africa Rising, if we look at the framework of the decade, the UN's decade of people of African descent and them kind of things there. These are terms that we're going to see floating around those arenas of the United Nations and the IMF and the World Bank, democracy. And when you look at any election in Africa or the Caribbean, that's a buzz term. We're trying to develop and sustain and maintain democracy. And democracy is a concept that is defined by Europe. And in fact, in some instances, that people would expressly tell you that we're trying to emulate Westminster democracy, Westminster jurisprudence. You will find in many African and Caribbean nations that the paraphernalia of authority in law and politics is defined by European culture. So you will see people wearing Queen Mary's wig, the white wig. In places like Zimbabwe and Nigeria and other places in the African diaspora, you'll find that under this auspices of the Commonwealth, that the monarch of England, Elizabeth II, is still the head of state and has representation via a governor general in those nations. This is democracy, as it is defined. And so, in emulating or trying to achieve democracy, Westminster democracy, we are in fact emulating Europeans, white people. All right. Then there's development. Development is a concept that is really defined via world institutions, multinational institutions, governed by Western imperialism. The United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the IMF is the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. These people are defining development, and they have a set paradigm to what the development of a nation looks like. It just so happens that their ideals of development tends to impoverish African people and African nations, or nations with an African majority population. All right. And so when we define our own development, economic development, by those standards, we further do harm to ourselves and our nations. And that is the goal of what Kwame Nkrumah defined as neocolonialism, whereby we are the face of the government, but the economic policy of our nations is governed from outside, quite directly, in fact, because when the IMF and the World Bank come into a nation, they give you a structured adjustment program. They tell you what to sell, what you can't sell, what to subsidize, what you can't subsidize, what to fund and what you can't fund. So directly, very directly, our economic policy is being driven from outside of those nations in the interest of people who do not look like us for their own benefit. And that was the whole reason for the makeup of the African continent as it is today, in terms of the borders that were drawn that make up these various 54 nations on the African continent today. And so these two concepts now feed into this idea of globalization, whereby they tell us that the world is becoming one big global community, but it just so happens that the cultural axis of this global community is Europe. The products that are made from Europe, the social and economic and technological advancement of Europe itself, particularly with things like the internet, because we live in the information age, but the information continues to be governed and controlled from a European center, which means that the world is globalized around the European center. And so again, continue to serve European interests. So we have to be careful of these buzz terms. And we emphasize the fact in the alchemy and revivalist movement that these, all of these terms, some of them are good stuff, like anti-slavery, independence is good. We don't want to be colonized by the European. You know what I'm saying? We don't want racism. Anti-racism is all good. But it's not enough. We're looking for liberation. So all of these things are euphemisms, which are weak terms, to trivialize, neutralize, pacify, and divert us from our fight for total liberation. Once again, trivialize, neutralize, pacify, and divert us from our fight for total liberation. We can see a prime example of this with the first item on the agenda, which was independence. And we want to remind ourselves at this point that at the independence ceremony of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, the Assaje for Kwame Nkrumah, said, yeah, that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the entire African continent. All right. Baba Patrice Lumumba, yeah, at the independence ceremony of Congo, the speech that got him in so much trouble, said that we are going to make the Congo the center of the sun's radius for the liberation of the entire African continent, or words to that effect. These two men have juxtaposed the idea of independence with the idea of liberation, which means that it was understood by many of the revolutionary movements at the time, understanding that not all of the movements, yeah, that were pushing for independence weren't necessarily revolutionary in their nature, but there were those who were. Those who were understood that independence was just a step in the right direction. It was a step on the road to total liberation. So they understood that the battle had not been won. Sorry, the war had not been won. A significant battle within the war had been won, but it was just a step. There was more steps to go, and that's what they were trying to achieve. All right. So many of us got caught up in the independence bug, and so it was the anti-Pan-African independence kind of push that resulted in the coming to fruition of neo-colonialism, which is the idea that these Europeans continue to dominate the economic life of the African in their own benefit. Okay. All right. So let's move forward now. And we're going to just I'm going to share with you a poem or a parable from a brother by the name of Heru. He is a member of the UNIA ACL, the organization that was founded by the most eminent prophet and king, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey. He's a spoken word artist, an entrepreneur, a health practitioner, and so much more, brothers and sisters. But as a spoken word artist, he's written this parable called Similarly Situated. So we're also, take in some of that vibes and give expression to some of what I've just explained.